right, guys, welcome back to another video on the life of Jesus. Today, we're going to be all over the place with texts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you haven't figured it out yet, each video is typically linked to the last. So, as I've said in the past, if you want the bigger picture, I encourage you to at least watch the previous video. And a link for that will be in the description. Okay, so now to our text for today. In this video, we're going to begin to unpack a discussion that Jesus had with his disciples that I believe helps the disciples better understand where they are in their journeys. Our text is found in Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 14, Mark chapter 9, verses 33 through 50, and Luke 9, 46 through 50. And as I said before, we're going to weave back and forth through all three accounts. So let's begin in Matthew's account. Matthew 18:1. Matthew says, at that time, or literally that hour, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now, when Matthew says, at that time, what time are we talking about? Well, this takes us back to our previous video, where we discussed the conversation Jesus had with Peter about paying the temple tax. But let's back up a bit to remind ourselves where we are. Jesus and his disciples have just returned to Capernaum. Well, prior to this, they were in the Decapolis region, and then they were in the mountainous region of Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus, Peter, James, and John were on the mount, and Jesus transfigured. Now remember, they came down off the mountain and discovered that the remaining disciples, at least some of them, were not able to cast out a demon. And the reason, essentially, was they still needed to grow. See, their hearts were not ready to take on a demon like this. And so I mention all of this because these are events that are connected, and they all help us paint a better picture of what is going on. And my hope is that you will see this as this message unfolds. Now, it seems that it is after all of this happens that they head back to Capernaum, where Jesus has made his home. And at some point, after they get back to Capernaum, Jesus, or Peter, is approached by the tax collectors. And now Matthew is the only one who mentions that particular event. But then it is after this that Matthew writes about our current situation, and both Mark and Luke as well. But Mark and Luke mention that our current situation took place once they returned to Capernaum. And it happens while they were in the house. And so at that time, or at that hour, I think refers to some moment, not long after the temple tax situation took place, when they're all gathered in this house. And so let's continue with what Matthew says. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now I'm using the ESV translation, which translates this verse a little different. You see, in the other translations and in Greek manuscripts, the phrase looks something like this. Who then is the greatest, or who therefore is the greatest. So this little word then or therefore adds a little something extra to the text. It indicates there was something else going on, some discussion, and perhaps something that happened that caused them to think about this or question what they thought. I mean, think about it. Who then is? That phrase is something you might say when someone is questioning your conclusion. For example, I might say, my dog is the most loyal in the world. And you might smirk and shake your head in disagreement, and I might say, then whose dog is? See, the statement, who then, highlights a disagreement, and maybe even a desire to settle this a disagreement. And I can tell you that there's definitely more to the story. While Matthew mentions this question posed by the disciples, both Mark and Luke mention the fact that the disciples had been arguing with each other over this. Look at Luke 9:46. Luke says, an argument arose among them as to which of them was the greatest. And it seems this argument had actually started on the journey to Capernaum. If you recall some of the previous events, I think you can see how this argument actually highlights part of what was going on with them. So there was still some pride and a certain way of thinking about things that had not yet been transformed. Now, real quickly, consider this. In Matthew 16, Jesus claims Peter will have the keys of the kingdom. This is a position of power and authority. And then only Peter, James, and John were taken up on the mountain with Jesus to pray. Now, imagine being the other disciples. You can imagine how these events might have stirred up a bit of jealousy and envy within their hearts. No wonder they couldn't cast out the demon from the Father's Son. And then when you consider the parable Jesus used when talking to Peter about who is obligated to pay the temple tax, I can see how this might have stirred up within them maybe more questions and debates about privilege and rank, even among themselves. So it looks like things are heating up among the disciples. And it's actually going to continue beyond this event. Because remember, eventually James and John, the sons of Zebedee, they will be so bold as to come to Jesus to ask for high positions by Jesus' side. Now, back to our text, Mark says it this way in Mark 9:33. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, that is Jesus, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent. For on the way, they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. But evidently, eventually someone spoke up and said something, which led to someone saying, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom?" It is at this point that Mark says, "And he," that is Jesus, "sat down and called the 12. And he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last. He must be last of all and servant of all." Of interest is this word translated servant, which is the Greek word diakonos, which in other places in the New Testament is transliterated as deacon. See, diakonos, or a servant, could have been someone who was either literally a slave or someone who was free. Now, the Greek word for slave is doulos, and this word represented the condition or status of a person, while diakonos represents the activity of the person, not necessarily their condition or status as slave or free. And it would be good to mention that the word diakonos is related to another Greek word, which means to pursue or to run, to be the follower of a person. Hence, it has more to do with what we might say is the occupation or the activity of the person. And what this demonstrates is that being a servant is not necessarily connected with one's status. Now, this is important to note as the text continues to unfold. Now, what Jesus has just said was in total contrast to how the world functioned and how people approached things, and still in many ways today. Now, how do you think the disciples would have responded hearing this in that moment? What do you think they thought about all of this, especially considering what they were arguing about? Now, consider Jesus. How would you try and get this point across, especially if you knew that this argument was just another demonstration of where their hearts were, but it was time to get to the heart of the problem? Well, look at what Jesus does. Luke 9:47. But Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a child and put him by his side. I like this phrase, knowing the reasoning of their hearts. This reasoning points to the condition of their hearts, and Jesus was aware of what was behind this argument and what it would take to reach them. And remember what Jesus told them when they questioned why they couldn't cast out the demon? He said this kind could only come out through prayer and fasting, and he talked about their faith. So when he did this, he touched on the issue. But now he's taking the opportunity to show them more. So he is aware of their hearts, what the root of the issue was and what they needed. And just as Jesus had demonstrated humility in paying the temple tax, he is now going to give them an object lesson in humility by using a child. Who is this child? Where did he come from? Well, I don't know. Could have been Peter's child. It could have been some of the other disciples, their children. But we don't know. But here's the picture. Jesus is sitting surrounded by his disciples, and he takes this child. Matthew 18:3 says, and Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And the word translated turn is a Greek word that literally means to turn in a different direction. So in other words, you're walking down the road or a hallway and you stop and turn and begin going another way. See, Jesus is telling his disciples, in light of all the recent events, that they're going in the wrong direction. They needed to stop and turn and go in a different direction. Think about it. They've been arguing about being the greatest in the kingdom. And Jesus says, forget about being the greatest. With the direction you're going, you're not even going to be in the kingdom. You see, this turning that needs to happen, it's in their hearts and their way of thinking, perceiving, and approaching life. And if you think about it, you can go all the way back to the Sermon on the Mount and see this message in great detail. But then Jesus goes on to say, in Matthew 18:4, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus says you must be last of all and servant of all and humble as a child. And the disciples would have immediately gotten the message. You see, in Aramaic, the word for child and servant, they were the same. But now notice, Jesus doesn't say, humble yourself like this child humbles himself. He says, whoever humbles himself like this child. See, this child who in his natural state is lowly in relation to, say, the adults. See, this child who holds no social status or notoriety. Think about it. The position children are in by their very nature of being children is one that represents humility. See, they're told where to go, what to do, and in Jesus' day, even who they're going to be. And in so many ways, regardless of what they want, children must submit to the ways of their parents or guardians. And this is something they really have no control over. And Paul mentions this concept in Galatians 4, when he says, think of it this way. If a father dies and leaves an inheritance for his young children, those children are not much better off than servants until they grow up, even though they actually own everything their father had. See, they have to obey their guardians until they reach whatever age their father said. And so Jesus is saying they need to adopt the posture of a servant, one who follows around another, and the posture of a child, which by their natural state, they have no social status. And so this posture of a servant and a child is one that is resigned to having no status, being marginalized, and maybe even despised. And since this is the way the kingdom works, their arguments about who will be the greatest, well, it's pointless. Why? Because in the kingdom, love conquers all. 1 Corinthians 13, love is the greatest, and love by its very nature is humble. It's patient and kind. It's not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It's not irritable, and it keeps no records of being wronged. Furthermore, Jesus will tell his disciples that the world will know who they are by how they love. So Jesus is showing his disciples how being the greatest in the kingdom means you must be content with not having status in this world. This includes not only the status like the patrons of their society, but even the way they personally think about themselves in their own minds and how they might want others to think about them. And now, Mark records something that Jesus did, which I find interesting. Mark says that Jesus took the child in his arms. And I think by doing this, Jesus is identifying the child with himself. Kind of like when saying things like, when you mess with him, you mess with me. And the point is, Jesus has this kid in his arms, and then he says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Now, then Mark adds that one who receives this child not only receives Jesus, but the one who sent Jesus, Mark 9:37. Now, remember there's an object lesson here. Never forget that in this text. But there are two Greek words that are translated receive, dekamai and lambano. Now, dekamai has to do with this joyful welcoming, this acceptance of something or someone, whereas lambano has to do with action that manifests the receiving. So it seems one is more of a mindset or expression of the heart, while the other is literally action that one takes, which demonstrates the receiving of something. Now, the word used here is dekamai, which, well, we're dealing with a mindset, a perspective. Now remember, again, this child is being used as an object lesson. Don't forget that. I know this passage is probably most often used to talk about how we should treat children or how we need to try and think more like children. And I'm not saying these aren't principles that apply there. I'm not saying we can't look at these and get things like this from it. However, it's important to remember that Jesus is specifically talking to his disciples, and this conversation is all about their argument over who the greatest will be. And so accepting this child is accepting the perspective and the mindset and approach of humility. You see, the way of Jesus is best modeled in children or servants. It's best modeled in the world's powerless, not the powerful. So in other words, Jesus is saying that receiving this child is receiving my approach, my perspective, my heart, which, by the way, I believe is this reason he puts this child in his arms and says, if you receive this child, you receive me and the one who sent me. It's like an identifying marker. So remember, this child is an object lesson. So Jesus is saying, this is my heart, right? And the heart of the kingdom and the heart of the Father. This is the direction you need to turn. Remember, these are guys Jesus is training to follow him when he's gone. They're going to be leaders of this thing that Jesus is doing. And if they are to lead properly, their hearts must continue to transform more and more like Jesus. If they are going to lead like Jesus, there's no room for jealousy and envy and arguing over things like this. They must be willing to sacrifice their own pride and way of thinking in order to lead properly. And of course, they have no clue what's coming, but they're going to be faced with lots of choices and decisions that will have to be made. Lots of changes and opposition will be in their future, and they will have to be able to navigate all of this together. But I can only imagine what it must have been like for them. And Jesus is basically turning everything upside down. Imagine hearing Jesus say these things, and in the backdrop of your mind, you have the arguments you had over who would be the greatest, replaying over and over. And what you might have heard in these moments was, if you think you're the greatest among the disciples, consider this. The greatest is actually the least. The greatest is actually likened to those who have no status, to those who are servants of all. So your fellow disciples, who you think are not as great as you, in the kingdom, they actually are greater. Again, just go back to Matthew 5, 6, and 7. This is how the kingdom works. And I think we can see how this all applies to us as well. Now, just think about this. If they would actually turn and begin to think and approach things in this way, they would be able to connect with anyone, even the lowest in the social status. It would help keep them from offending or causing others to stumble or to lose faith. Oh, and this is something they so desperately needed to hear, as you will see in what happens next in this conversation. But for that, you will have to wait till next time. Thanks for watching. Grace and peace. And we'll talk to you soon.